Sylvie Doyle. Hired in March of '98. Gone by October.
Where did you get that?
From the same drawer you have been dusting for 4 months, Miss Doyle.
Put it down.
You truly did not know. That is almost worse.
Sabine, that is enough.
Adrian, ask her whose name is on the tag around her neck.
I know whose it is, Sabine.
Then you know why she left.
Don't.
Look at her face, Adrian.
October of '98. That is all the file says.
It says a great deal more.
I'd have loved you too, Adrian, right up until tonight.
You already want to know what that file said. Subscribe, so the answer finds you. Back to the morning 4 months earlier. The house on Ridgemont Hill did not change hands that autumn. It changed something harder. 4 months before that night, Tessa Doyle stood outside a hardware store on Sumner Street. She counted what was left in her coat pocket, $6 and some change. It had to cover the bus both ways, and a loaf of bread. She had been turned down 8 times since April. She had stopped keeping the letters. The woman behind the counter had been kind about it, which was worse. Kindness made it take longer. Tessa walked to the corner and waited for the light. Under her collar, on a thin chain, hung a small black tag with white letters pressed into it. She touched it without thinking. It had been her mother's. It was all she had that was. The flat was 2 rooms above a shuttered dry cleaner. The heat came on when it wanted to. Tessa hit the switch twice on her way in and heard nothing move in the walls. Rudy was at the kitchen table with his books spread out. He was 14 and already taller than she was. He had not gotten used to it. He sat with his shoulders pulled in, like the chair might be too small. He looked up. "You got the bread." "I got the bread." "There's a thing on the fridge." There was always a thing on the fridge. Tessa read it standing up. A field trip to the state capitol in October. $25. A line at the bottom for a parent or guardian. She signed the line. Her signature had gotten smaller over 3 years. She put the pen down. "The money's not till the 10th. I can skip it." "You're not skipping it, Tess. It's $25, and it's October. That's 4 paychecks from now, Rudy." He did not point out that there were no paychecks. That was the thing about her brother. He knew which sentences to leave alone. She made eggs, because eggs were what there was. They ate with his homework pushed to one side. He told her about a boy who had brought a snake to school in a shoebox. She laughed in the right places. Some nights, that was the whole job. After he went to bed, she sat under the lamp with the newspaper and a pen. There was a photograph on the shelf above the radiator. Her mother in a parking lot, squinting, holding a paper cup. Somebody took it 3 years ago, outside the clinic on Fairlane. It was the last one anybody took. Sylvie Doyle had cleaned other people's houses for 26 years. She never once talked about it at home. When Tessa was small, she thought the work must be boring. Later, she understood it was a door her mother kept shut. And she had been raised well enough not to open other people's doors. The tag came out of a shoebox after the funeral. Black, hard, the size of a matchbook. The letters were pressed into it in white. S. Doyle. There was a pin on the back, bent from years of use. Tessa strung it on a chain and had worn it since. She did not know which house it came from. There had been so many. A family in Bell Meadow, a widower on Cross Street, a woman with 6 cats, whose name Tessa could no longer remember. Any of them might have handed out tags like that once. There was nobody left to ask. She circled 3 listings and crossed out 2 before she turned off the lamp. In the dark, the radiator knocked twice and went quiet. Nuoke's was on the corner of Sumner and 9th. It had been there longer than the bank across from it. Abasi Nuoke let people sit, and that was the whole reason the place stayed full. $1 coffee bought a table for the afternoon, and nobody came to move anyone off it. Tessa took the seat by the window because the light was better for small print. He set the cup down. 8. You told me 6 last week. It's 8 now. Then I have something. He wiped his hands on the navy apron and pushed his glasses up. The big house on the hill. Lock. They want 2 for the house staff before September. The one behind the wall? That one. He sat down across from her, which he did not do for everyone. Their cook comes in on Thursdays. She says the woman who runs the house is fair, and the pay is real. She also says they have not hired from outside in 4 years. Tessa turned the cup around without drinking from it. Why me? Because you have been in here 11 weeks, and you have never once let me put your coffee on the house. He stood back up. Go tomorrow. Early. Ask for Mrs. Bray. She was at the gate at 8 in the morning. The wall ran along the top of the hill for 200 yards. The gate in the middle of it was iron. Beyond it, the drive went up through cut grass to a house, the color of bone, and a fountain ran in the front court. She could count 16 windows on the front. There were more she could not see. She pressed the button on the post. A woman's voice came out of the speaker, flat and unhurried. It asked her name and her business. Then it told her to walk along the wall to the service entrance, second door, and to mind the delivery van coming through. So Tessa walked the wall. The service entrance was set 3 steps below the ground. The paint on the door was gray. Under the bell, somebody had taped a strip of card with "staff" written on it in ballpoint. She had been in enough back doors to know what a building was telling her. Odette Bray was 63 years old and did not shake hands. She stood in a corridor with a fluorescent tube, humming over her, and a ring of keys at her hip. She looked at Tessa for a good 3 seconds before she said anything. You came the long way around the wall. I was told to. I know. I told you. She turned and started walking. Most people arrive annoyed about it. It shows in the face. The corridor smelled of soap and hot linen. They passed a doorway with 2 industrial washers behind it, and a wooden filing cabinet against the far wall. Then they were in a small office with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window up near the ceiling. Mrs. Bray did not pick up the folder Tessa had brought. Show me your hands. Tessa put them on the desk, palms down, then turned them over. The older woman studied them the way a farrier studies a hoof. Not unkindly, only carefully. You have worked. Since I was 17. Mrs. Bray let go of her hand. Where? 2 hotels, a nursing home, and the laundry on 9th. The laundry closed in April. And before the hotels, Miss Doyle? School. And my mother's jobs, on Saturdays, when she needed the hands. Something went across Mrs. Bray's face, and left again before it could be named. Come back Thursday at 9. Mr. Locke sees the last 2 himself. She opened the door. Wear what you have on. On Thursday there were 2 of them, waiting in the downstairs corridor. The other woman was older, and had brought a folder with plastic sleeves in it. She went in first, and came out in 6 minutes with her chin up and her eyes wet. Mrs. Bray held the door. Miss Doyle. They went up by the back stairs. Tessa noticed it, because there was a wide staircase, visible through the archway at the end of the hall, carpeted, with a rail on both sides. They did not use it. The back stairs were narrow and wooden and lit by 1 bulb. Her shoulder brushed the wall twice on the way up. The study at the top was full of late morning light. Adrian Locke was 34 and stood when she came in, which she had not expected. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. There was an old leather watch on his left wrist, with the strap gone soft. Mr. Locke. Miss Doyle. Sit, please. He had her folder on the desk, and he did not open it either. Apparently that ran in the house. Mrs. Bray tells me you were at the laundry on 9th. 4 years. What happened to it, Miss Doyle? The owner died, and his son sold the building. It's a phone store now. So it wasn't the work. No, sir. It was the building. He nodded slowly, as if that answer had cost him something. I'm going to ask one question that matters. The rest is paperwork. All right. Who are you when the house is empty? Tessa took a moment with it. Outside the window, a man was dragging a hose across the grass. The same one who works when it's full. That's a short answer. It's a short question, Mr. Locke. If I have to think about it, I'd be lying. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, and he put it away. There's a room downstairs if you want it. Most people take it the first winter, and then find their own place. He turned a page he had not been reading. Do you have people? A brother. He's 14. He'd stay at ours. Then take the wage and skip the room, Miss Doyle. I'd like the room 3 nights a week, if that can be done. The bus stops running at 11. It can be done. That was the whole of it. She was hired on a Thursday in the last week of June, at a wage. $11 an hour, better than the laundry. She walked back down the narrow stairs behind Mrs. Bray. Her hands were shaking, and her face was perfectly still. The uniforms were in a cupboard in the housekeeping office. Gray, and better cloth than she had expected. Mrs. Bray took 2 off the rail, folded them over her arm, and turned around. Then she stopped. She was looking at Tessa's collar, at the thin chain, and the small, black tag that had come out from under it when Tessa sat down. The fluorescent tube hummed above them. Fix your chain. It shows. Tessa tucked it away. Sorry. It's not a rule. It'll catch on things, that's all. She held out the uniforms. Monday, 7. Come to this door. She said nothing else about it. She said very little for the rest of that afternoon, and Tessa put it down to the woman simply being that way. The house had 2 of everything, and the halves did not look alike. Upstairs there were tall windows. There were lamps with warm shades. There was a rug in the long hall that ate the sound of footsteps. Downstairs there was painted concrete and a fluorescent tube every 12 feet. The windows were set up near the ceiling, because downstairs was half a floor under the grass. 6 people worked below the line. A cook, a driver, 2 on grounds, and now 2 in the house. On Monday morning, Mrs. Bray walked her through it in 11 minutes. Laundry. Both machines are yours, and neither one likes a full load. She pushed a door. Linen. Count it Fridays. Housekeeping office. You know that one. Your room's the last on the left. There's a chair by the door that nobody has ever sat in. Where do I eat? Here, at the long table, at 12:30. Not upstairs, and not standing up. Mr. Locke has a thing about people eating standing up. And the stairs? The back ones. She said it without any weight on it at all. Family uses the front. If you meet one of them in the upstairs hall, you step to the wall and let them by. Don't make a performance of it. Yes, ma'am. It's not because of you, Miss Doyle. It has been that way in this house since it was built. It was that way in the last house I worked in. It will be that way after all of us. She looked at her once. Some houses tell you what they are on the first day. This one does. Believe it, and you'll be fine here. The laundry was the best room. Downstairs, and Tessa liked it by the end of the week. It was warm. The high window let in a strip of sky. The linen came out of the dryer smelling of nothing at all, which was the whole point of good soap. Against the far wall stood a wooden filing cabinet. 4 drawers, painted the same gray as the door. The top 3 held the ordinary things. Invoices for detergent, manufacturer's cards for the machines, 20 years of water bills that nobody had thrown out, because nobody had been told to. The bottom drawer stuck. It was not locked. There was no lock on it to turn. Inside that drawer, under a folded canvas apron, was a household wage ledger for the year 1998. Green cloth cover. The corners had gone soft. On the 11th page, in a column of 19 names, was one line opened in March and closed in October. S. Doyle. House staff. Hired the 9th of March. And in the last column, where a reason was supposed to go, somebody had written 4 words. The hand did not match a single other entry in the book. Nobody in that house had opened the bottom drawer in 27 years. It was not locked, and it was not hidden. It sat 11 feet from the machine, where Tessa Doyle now folded sheets 6 days a week. Everything that happened afterward turned on it. She did not open it. She had no reason on earth to. She wiped the top of that cabinet every Tuesday, because Mrs. Bray had said to wipe the tops of things. She did it well. She never once pulled the handle. In the 2nd week of August, Mrs. Bray put a single key on the table beside Tessa's plate. The library, from Monday. Mornings, before he comes down. I thought Denise had the library. Denise has the guest wing now. She went back to her tea. It isn't a promotion, and there's no more money in it. It's the room he sits in. That's all it is. It was not all it was, and everybody at the long table knew it. The way up was the back stairs, and then the length of the upstairs hall. Tessa walked it at 6:10 with a cloth over her shoulder. She set the bucket down twice to change hands. One wall of that hall was portraits, 8 of them, all black and white, all framed the same. Each had a small brass plate screwed into the frame below it. She read them because they were there. Marcus Locke, who built the house, his wife, 2 brothers in high collars, a woman in a hat like a dinner plate, and second from the end, a man of about 50 in a dark tie, photographed straight on, not smiling. Whitaker Locke, 1946 to 2011. He had his son's shoulders. That was the only thing she noticed about him on the first morning. She noticed it for less than a second. Then she went in and opened the curtains. The library was 3 walls of shelves, a ladder on a rail, and one good chair by the window. There was a cold cup of coffee on the arm of that chair every single morning. He drank half and forgot the rest. She took it down and washed it. Neither of them mentioned that this had become a system. On the 4th morning, he came in while she was up the ladder. Don't come down. I've been trying to find that one for a week. Which one? Green spine, 3 from your left. No, the other left. She got it and came down and handed it over. Then she stood there a beat too long because she had read the title on the way down. You know it. I know it. She wiped her hands on her apron out of habit. The 9th door at Marham Bay. Nobody knows it. It's out of print. I have looked. The library on Fairlane had it. Children's floor. The shelf by the radiator. Tessa heard herself keep going and could not think why. I took it out so many times they stopped stamping the card. The woman at the desk just waved me through. Adrian turned the book over in his hands. How old were you? 9. 10. She shrugged. We moved a lot. It's about a house that keeps growing extra rooms. I thought that was the best idea anybody ever had. My mother read it to me in this room, in that chair. He looked at the window. She died when I was 8. I have never once been able to make anybody understand why. I keep looking for it. There was a stretch of quiet then. It was not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual in that house. I have a meeting at 8. Leave the curtains as they are. The lights better half open. Yes, Mr. Locke. He got as far as the door. There's a step stool in the cupboard under the stairs. The ladder rail sticks past the 4th shelf. I nearly went off it in March. Then he was gone. Tessa stood in the middle of the room, holding a cloth, and downstairs somebody put a kettle on. The rain came in on the first Friday of September and stayed 4 days. The conservatory was glass on 3 sides and joined the house at the back. The linen for the guest wing went through it, because that was the short way. On the second afternoon, Tessa was halfway across the terrace with a covered basket. Then the sky opened properly. She got under the eave. The eave was about 2 feet deep. It was enough for one person. Adrian was already standing in it. Sorry, sir. Get under it. There isn't room. There's room if neither of us moves. He shifted anyway, back against the glass. Put the basket down. It's covered. So they stood there, 8 inches apart, watching it come down on the grass. For a while, neither of them said anything. I like this. The rain? Being made to stop. Nobody can ask you for anything in the rain. He laughed once, quietly. That's the most accurate thing anybody has said in this house all year. Mrs. Bray says it'll be through by Monday. Mrs. Bray has been right about weather for as long as I've been alive. My father used to check her against the radio. He watched the fountain filling past its rim. Can I ask you something that isn't my business? You can ask. What would you be doing if the laundry hadn't closed and none of this had happened? Tessa thought about lying, because the truth sounded like a child's answer. Then she decided she was too tired to bother. A library. A room, really, not a whole building. She kept her eyes on the grass, somewhere warm, with the books out where people can reach them. No card. Nobody watching what you take. A room with no card. That library on Fairlane closed in 2019. The nearest one now is 2 buses. She adjusted her grip on the basket she had already put down. Rudy's 14. He'll read anything you put in front of him. He just needs it to be in front of him. And you'd run it. I'd keep it clean and open it on time. That's most of running anything. The rain slackened. Neither of them moved for a moment longer than the rain required. Go on. Before it starts again, she went. Halfway across the terrace, she heard her name, and she turned. And he had not moved off the glass. It's not a child's answer, Miss Doyle. 4 days later, there was a book on the chest of drawers in her room. It was the same edition. Green cloth. The title in a font nobody had used since 1971. The second printing, with the map on the end paper. Somebody had set it down squarely, the way a person puts down something she has been thinking about while carrying it. There was no note. There was no card. Nothing was written inside the cover. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed with it in her lap for a long time. Then she put it in the drawer, under her folded uniforms. A thing like that, in a house like that, was not safe out on a surface. She did not say thank you. She was not supposed to know. Now before we go on, if you're still with me, do me one small thing. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's out there in the dark. All right, back to the long table and the last week of September, when everything arrived at once. Winnie Locke came home on a Tuesday with a canvas rucksack and no warning. She was 27, and she came down the back stairs before she had taken her coat off. It was the fastest way to the kitchen, and she had never once thought about it any other way. There's a new one. Nobody told me. Mrs. Bray did not look up from the linen count. Miss Doyle. Since June. Hello, Miss Doyle. Miss Locke. Winnie. Nobody calls me the other thing. She was already going through the bread bin. Is there any of the seeded left? Or has Marcus had it all again? Tessa liked her within about 90 seconds, which was roughly how long it took most people. Adrian came down looking for his sister and found her sitting on the counter, eating bread with her boots on. Neither of those was allowed. You said Thursday. I said Thursday, so you wouldn't send the car. She pointed the bread at Tessa. Why has nobody mentioned her to me? Because you don't answer your phone. That is a separate problem. That was Tuesday, and it was the good part of the week. Sabine Roth arrived on the Friday. Nobody at the long table had been told about that one either. The driver came in at 4 to say the front gate had opened. Mrs. Bray set down the cup she was holding and stood up. Marcus, the guest suite. Now, please. Which one? The one at the front. She'll ask for it, so save yourself the trip. She untied her apron and folded it over the back of a chair. There was something in the way she did it that made the room go quiet. Tessa was in the upstairs hall with a bucket when they came in. She stepped to the wall, the way she had been told, and let them by. The woman who came through the door first was about 33, thin, and dressed in something the color of unbleached paper. She carried a manila envelope in her left hand, the way a person carries something she has brought a long way on purpose. Adrian. Sabine. You look tired. It suits you better than it used to. She handed her coat to nobody in particular and looked around the hall, as though checking it against an inventory. The Hartleys said you had not been out since Easter. I told them that was a lie. Now I find I was wrong. You could have called. I did call. Twice. In July. She smiled without any of it reaching her eyes. You have someone new. Tessa did not look up from the wall. Miss Doyle has been with us since June. Since June. Sabine turned the envelope over once in her hand. How nice. I do love a house that hires. Then she went up the front stairs. Downstairs, Mrs. Bray closed the door of the housekeeping office. She stayed in there with the light on for 40 minutes. When she came out, she gave nobody a reason. Sabine Roth stayed 11 days. She did not do one thing that anybody could have written down. She was polite at the table. She thanked the cook by name. On the third morning, she came down to say the guest suite was lovely and that she hoped she had not made extra work. Mrs. Bray said no, ma'am. That was all. She had another way of working. Miss Doyle. You've been here since June, is that right? Yes, ma'am. And they've given you the library. Sabine stood in the doorway of it with a cup in her hand. That's quick. Denise had the library 4 years. Mrs. Bray decides the rooms. Mrs. Bray decides a great many things. She came in and looked along the shelves without touching them. The staff are fond of you. The cook told me so twice, unprompted. I thought that was a great deal of information for one woman, to volunteer to a guest. Tessa kept working. Being liked downstairs is a pleasant thing. It isn't the same as being family. I say that because nobody in this house will. No, ma'am. You aren't going to argue with me. You haven't said anything that isn't true, ma'am. Sabine looked at her then, properly, for the first time. No. I suppose I haven't. She left the cup on the shelf. Tessa took it down after she had gone and washed it with the other one. The stairs came back that same week. It had never been written anywhere. Mrs. Bray had said it once in June, and it had simply been the shape of the days after that. But on the Thursday, Sabine was coming down the front stairs. As Tessa crossed the hall with an armful of linen, she stopped 4 steps up and waited. The back stairs are for the linen. It's not a punishment. This rail was refinished in the spring. Yes, ma'am. You understand I'm not being unkind. I understand, ma'am. Winnie was standing in the archway at the end of the hall, with an apple in her hand. She had heard all of it. Sabine. Winnie, darling. The rail was refinished in 2018. Was it? Sabine went on down. Tessa took the linen the long way around. She did not say anything about it at the table that night. When Winnie tried to bring it up, she changed the subject to the seeded bread, twice, until Winnie let her. That was the 10th day. On the 11th, at 9 at night, the library light was still on. Tessa had come up for the cup, which she did not usually do that late. Adrian was in the doorway when she turned around. Neither of them had planned any part of it. You should go home. The bus. I'm on the room tonight. He did not move out of the doorway, and she did not walk around him. The whole thing took about 4 seconds. Then it had happened, and it could not be made not to have happened. She stepped back first. Mr. Locke. Adrian. She kept her hand on the doorframe. Not in this house. Not with your name on the outside of it. Then say it once, and I'll wait as long as you want. If the words, Adrian. She went down the back stairs with her heart going like a bird in a box. She was smiling in the dark. She did not know where the woman in the front guest suite had spent that afternoon. It was the county records office on Wexford Street. On the 12th evening, Sabine asked for the drawing room at 8. She asked for it through the house phone. She asked for Mrs. Bray and Miss Doyle to be present. Nobody downstairs had ever heard a guest do that. Tessa went up the back stairs in her uniform. The upstairs hall was lit low. She walked the length of the portrait wall to reach the drawing room door, past the brass plates and the high collars. She went by the second from the end without looking at it. Winnie was standing by the window with her arms crossed and her jaw set. Mrs. Bray had come up before them and stood near the door, not sitting. Adrian was on his feet. This is a strange way to do whatever this is. It is. Sabine sat at the low glass table with the envelope in front of her. I did consider doing it privately. Then I decided that would be a favor to the wrong person. She opened it and laid out 3 things, squarely, one beside the other. County records, Wexford Street. Anyone may request them. A live birth registered in February of 1999. Mother, Sylvie Doyle, 24. Father, not entered. Sabine. And this. Her hand moved to the second page. A copy of a page from your own house ledger. 1998. I asked the office for the staff records of that year. Your father's clerk kept everything in triplicate, which I have always thought was the mark of a careful man. The room had gone very quiet. Sylvie Doyle. Hired in March of 98. Gone by October. Where did you get that? That was Tessa. It was the first thing she had said since coming through the door. From the same drawer you have been dusting for 4 months, Miss Doyle. Sabine did not say it cruelly. That was the worst of it. A copy of it. The original is downstairs, 11 feet from your machine. Put it down. You truly did not know. That is almost worse. Sabine. That is enough. Adrian, ask her whose name is on the tag around her neck. I know whose it is, Sabine. Then you know why she left. Don't. Winnie had come off the window. Make her stop, Adrian. Look at her face. Sabine turned the ledger page toward him. She doesn't know. Neither do you. Read the last column. He read it. It took him a while, and he did not look up when he had finished. Let go. October of 98. That is all the file says. It says a great deal more. Turn the page over. Sabine sat back. 4 words in the reason column, in a hand that appears nowhere else in the book. Dishonesty. See private note. There's no note. No. There is a line telling you there was one. She let that sit. Your father dismissed a pregnant housemaid in October and wrote dishonesty in the call. 4 months later, that child was born 11 miles from this room. In June, you hired her and gave her the library and stood under an eave with her in the rain. Get out of my house. I will. In the morning, Sabine stood and gathered nothing because she had brought only paper, and she was leaving it. I did not make any of this, Adrian. I only asked for it. They gave it to me because it has been public for 27 years, and nobody in this family ever went and looked. She went to the door. Mrs. Bray stepped aside for her without being asked. The older woman's face had gone the color of the wall. Adrian crossed the room. Tessa, don't. She had not moved from where she was standing. Under the low light, the small black tag hung out over her collar, and she did not tuck it in. Say something true instead. Was it your father's hand? If the words... Yes. You knew his hand straight off. You didn't have to think. Yes. Tessa let out a breath. All right. She looked at him for a moment. She was not crying, and she did not raise her voice. Winnie said afterward that this was the part she could not get out of her head. I'd have loved you too, Adrian, right up until tonight. Then she went out through the door and down the back stairs, because those were the stairs. Behind her, the portrait of a man in a dark tie went on, not smiling, at the wall. She packed in 9 minutes, because there was almost nothing in the room. The 2 uniforms went folded on the end of the bed, with the collars square. She was not going to be a person who left a mess behind her. The green book came out of the drawer and went into her bag. She thought about leaving it. Then she decided a thing given without a name on it belonged to whoever it was given to. And she took it. The tag stayed where it was. It did not once occur to her to take it off. Mrs. Bray was in the corridor by the housekeeping office, with her hand on the frame. Miss Doyle. Tessa stopped. Were you here? In 98? The fluorescent tube hummed above them both. Yes. Then you knew her, Mrs. Bray. Yes. Did you know she was carrying a child when they put her out? The older woman's mouth moved, and nothing came out of it. That's all I wanted. Good night, Mrs. Bray. She caught the last bus at 4 minutes past 11 with her bag on her knees. Rudy was still up, because the boy had a sense for these things. He took one look at her in the doorway and put the kettle on without being asked. It was the single kindest thing anybody did for her that night. They sat at the kitchen table, with the field trip form still on the fridge behind them. You're not going back. No. Because of him. Because of his father. She turned the cup without drinking from it. Mom worked in that house, Rudy, before I was born. They put her out in October and wrote down that she was dishonest. 4 months later, she had me. Her brother sat with that a while. He was 14, and he had their mother's way of going quiet before. He said the thing that mattered. Did she ever say? Not once. 26 years. Then she didn't want you carrying it. Tessa put her hand flat on the table. Here's what I have to do. I have to find work by the 10th. Your trip's 25, and the rent's the 14th, and neither of those cares whose house it was. She looked up. So I'm going to be at Nwoke's at 7, and I'm going to start again. And I need you to not look at me like that while I do it. I wasn't. You were a bit. I was a bit. She laughed, which surprised her. It came out wrong, and turned into something else halfway through. Her brother came around the table and stood next to her chair until it had finished. 4 miles away, in a house with 16 windows on the front of it, Adrian Locke sat on the floor of his father's old office, with a filing box open in front of him. He had gone through 11 of them by 2 in the morning. Property. Trusts. 40 years of letters to a solicitor in the city, filed by year and tied with tape. There was nothing about the house staff at all. Whitaker Locke had not kept one page of it where his family could find it. Winnie appeared in the doorway in her coat, having not gone to bed either. Adrian. There's nothing here. I know there's nothing there. She crouched and put her hand flat on the lid of the box he was reaching for. You're looking in the wrong half of the house. They went down at 6:30 in the morning, before the cook came in. Mrs. Bray was already in the laundry with the light on. She had the ring of keys off her hip and in her hand. She stood in front of the gray filing cabinet, and she had been standing there some time. The bottom one. It sticks. It has never been locked. Winnie knelt and pulled it. The apron came out first, folded. Then the ledger, green cloth, corners gone soft. Winnie set it on the ironing table and turned to the 11th page. The 3 of them read one line in a column of 19. Under the apron, there was a foolscap envelope, with nothing written on the outside. Inside was a single sheet in a private hand. Adrian read it twice. Then he set it down on the table so the other 2 could see it. He found he did not want to be the only one holding it. The girl is expecting. It cannot be in the house. Enter it as the other thing and settle her week. That's his hand. Yes, Adrian. That is his hand. I know it is. Mrs. Bray put her keys down on the table. She did it carefully, the way a person sets something down, when her hands are not entirely her own. There were 4 of us who signed the dismissal. The head of house, the clerk, the driver who is dead now, and me. I was 36. I had held this post 11 months. She was looking at the wall above the machines. She was in this room when they told her. She folded the sheets she had in her arms and put them on the shelf. Then she went. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Bray." She said it going out the door. "You could have told me any day for 27 years. Yes. Why didn't you? Because the same man who wrote that note signed my wage." She still did not turn around. And because after a while, it stopped being a thing I had done. It became a thing that had happened. That is how it works, Mr. Locke. That is the whole of how it works. He found Tessa at the window table at Nwoke's at 8:30, with the newspaper open and a pen beside it. "I'm not coming back to the house." She said it before he had sat down. "I'm not asking you to." "Then why?" "Because I'm going to say it out loud in front of everyone who works there. I would rather you heard it from me first." He put the copy on the table between them, face up. It was the pregnancy. He wrote the other word so it would look like a reason. Tessa read it. She read it 3 times. Then she folded her hands on the table and sat very still. "Your father owes an apology to a woman who's been dead 3 years. You can't pay that. No. So don't stand in that hall and tell me you're sorry for it. It isn't mine to take." "I know." He turned the paper around. "There's a wage that stopped in October of 98, and a notice period that was never paid, and 27 years since. The estate can calculate all of it. It goes to her family, which is you and your brother. It is not a gift, and I will not have it called one. It's arrears. And the file, the reason column, gets struck through. The note goes in beside it, in the ledger, in the house, permanently. Anybody who opens that drawer again reads what actually happened." Tessa looked out the window for a while, at the bank across the street. Put her name back on the list of people who worked there. Properly. Not in a footnote. "It's the first thing I'll do." He did it on the Saturday morning, in the downstairs corridor, with every person who worked in that house standing along the wall. His sister was beside him. The ledger was open in his hands. Sabine Roth came down for it. She stood at the back in her coat, with her bag already by the door. She was not shouted at, and she was not thrown out, and nothing was taken from her. She had gone to a public office, asked for a public record, and read it out in a room. And every word of it had been true. What she wanted was a man back. What she did was open the one door in that house nobody had been willing to touch. Winnie spoke to her evenly. "You'll want to be somewhere else by lunch." "I imagine I will." That was the last anybody in Ridgemont saw of her. Afterward, Mrs. Bray stayed behind in the laundry with the ledger, while the others went up. "I keep thinking somebody should have opened that drawer years ago." Tessa was in the doorway with her coat still buttoned. "No. Somebody should have written the truth in it the first time. The drawer only ever kept what they put there." The arrears came to a figure with a comma in it. It was paid in one payment in November. Tessa put the whole of it in the bank and did not touch it for 5 months. She did not go back to the house that winter. She worked at Nwoke's 4 days a week and took a bookkeeping course 2 evenings. Adrian Locke drove to the corner of Sumner and 9th on Thursdays. He sat at the window table and waited to be told whether he was welcome. In February, she told him he was. By the following spring, the back stairs had a door at the bottom of them. The door was locked, and the key had come off Mrs. Bray's ring. Staff came in at the front now, with everybody else. There was a fortnight of people forgetting and going the old way out of habit. Then there was not. The library opened on the last Saturday in April. It was the room with 3 walls of shelves and the ladder on the rail. It was open to the town on Saturdays and Wednesday evenings. There was no card, no fee, and nobody at the door writing down what anyone took. A brass plate went up in the downstairs corridor, rather than the front hall, at the head of the long table where the staff ate. Tessa had been asked where she wanted it, and that was what she said. The Sylvie Doyle Room. Free to the town, Wednesdays and Saturdays. She ran it. She had applied in writing, like everybody else, and Mrs. Bray had sat on the panel. Afterward, the two of them had a cup of tea in the laundry and said almost nothing for 20 minutes. Rudy came on Saturdays, shelved returns badly, and read behind the door. On the first wet Wednesday in May, the rain came in hard off the hill. Tessa crossed the conservatory with a box of new spines under her arm. She stopped and set it down and opened the long window at the end, so the sound of it came in over the tiles. Under her collar, on a thin chain, hung a small black tag with white letters pressed into it. She had never taken it off. It had gone through the whole of that autumn and that winter against her skin. Somewhere along the way, it had stopped, being the only thing she had of her mother, because now there was a room with the name on the door. She left the window open and went in to unlock at 6. "Now let me ask you something. What would you have done, standing in that hall with your mother's name in a stranger's hand? Tell me down in the comments." I read every one. Rest easy now. There will be another one waiting the next time you come this way.